So Philip, many of us in the group of contemporary historians at Deakin work in ways such that our sense of history really involves often engaging with what collective memory is doing in the world today as well. One of the areas in which we see that on spectacular display is in Europe at the moment, as Europe, or different parts of Europe in particular, try to come to terms with, accept, sometimes find problems with the rapid influx of refugees. In your view, how does this process have echoes of remembering past times, and what are the implications of collective remembering in relation to what we're seeing in Europe today?
Well, David, I think the last time that we saw such a massive, uncontrolled influx of refugees in Europe was in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, even its latter stages. Most of them were ethnic Germans who had been expelled from East and Central Europe back to Germany by liberated countries. But there was also another mass movement of people in the other direction, and that is Germany's victims, Germany's Eastern workers, those who had been taken to Germany by ruse or by force to work for the Reich, were going home, some to the Soviet Union willfully or unwillfully, and others in all sorts of directions wherever the winds took them. This was an incredible movement, a chaotic movement that sort of defies the contemporary imagination, I think, in Europe. What we see today is a contemporary Europe coming to terms with a different sort of refugee crisis, a refugee crisis where the people look slightly different to those who came in 45 and 46. Though I should say that in Germany there was significant antipathy among Germans within the Reich toward the new settlers that came from East and Central Europe, even though they were considered to be the same people. Most Germans within Germany consider these people to be of a lesser cultural value, consider them to be historically handicapped given the fact that they've lived in areas that were culturally backward in their opinion, and given the significant material pressures in post-war Germany of food, housing and so forth, considered them to be an incredible burden. So there's interesting parallels to mass antagonism toward new arrivals in 45 and 46 as there is today, albeit toward people who come not from Europe but from North Africa and the Middle East. What I think is important for us today is to try and understand how post-war memory, how post-war understandings of that tragic period in the immediate aftermath of the war, particularly in terms of the refugee crisis, but also about what the war meant for East and Central Europe, resonates today in the different responses to the refugee crisis that we see across these two halves of East and West Europe. We see a fundamentally different response between, at least between governments in Germany, that are much more willing to accept the influx of refugees than there are from former communist states in East Europe and Central Europe that are fundamentally opposed, not only by governments but also by popular governments that are tapping in to a real sense of antagonism among their populations toward this influx. And I think I'd venture to suggest that these different responses have a lot to do with the ways in which these different sides of Europe came to terms with their pasts and what they did and what was done to them in the Second World War and its immediate aftermath. And I think in sort of exploring this theme this way, we do real justice to what our Contemporary Histories Group does in dealing with pasts that are still with us.
So you're suggesting, Philip, then that a greater sense of collective memory at work in those nations currently struggling to receive refugees would be beneficial? Or are you suggesting that it's a forgetfulness which is sometimes getting in the way of thinking broadly about the tremendous chaos and the kind of human justice issues in their midst?
Well, let's speak generally of East and West, although there are many divisions along that axis. Germany famously forgot, for the first generation after the Second World War, what it had done in that war. It was a convenient forgetting to move on. It was central to the country, at least West Germany, reconstructing, becoming the powerhouse that it did. In the east of Europe, there was a different form of forgetting. Those countries under Soviet domination or Soviet sponsored regimes, it wasn't forgetting about the war. It was a mismemory of what the war meant and what the war represented. A mismemory that was propagated by Soviet socialist regimes that buttressed their rule, that was central to creating the type of society that they wanted to create. And this myth, this mismemory across Eastern Europe and the Soviet-controlled space was strangely uniform, probably until the 80s, when the ties of the Soviet, the binds began to loosen, and people in these countries began to ask questions not only about the way in which they were ruled from Moscow today, but the way in which their histories, their own personal histories, had been swallowed by the Soviet state, had been regurgitated into something that was what they considered to be not only offensive but fundamentally untrue. The problem with all of this is that with the collapse of the Soviet Union into the 90s and now into the 21st century, these memories that people held on a personal level, these illegal underground memories of who fought what war and what was done to who was a victim, who was a perpetrator, what the war meant, all these different personal memories that simmered beneath the surface, repressed by a fundamentally ideological uniformity coming from the Soviet state, burst open into a new arena where there was no new repressive regime to delineate between what was right, what was wrong, what was accurate, what was not. It was an explosion of memory in the collapse of the Soviet Union. The commonality among these different memories, some legitimate, some not, some more accurate, some not, was that by virtue of the fact that they had resisted Soviet rule, this universally acclaimed evil that had now been swept into the dustbin of history, by virtue of the fact that they were resistors, they were somehow legitimate. But the problem is, David, that so many of the resistors to Soviet rule during and after the war were not only fighting against Soviet power, many of them were fighting for the type of state and national unity that was fundamentally xenophobic, that was ethnically cleansed, that was proto-fascist. The difficulty for these countries is that their greatest heroes in fighting the Soviet Union, in fighting this repression, were fighting for a type of society that today is fundamentally, for most people, not only unrecognisable, not only not attractive, but downright dangerous.
And you've talked about, Philip, this east-west divide, and your comments go particularly to the east
Yes.
of Europe in the last few minutes. But I'd suggest to you too that there's sort of a consensus here too in terms of the elevation of the war, World War II, as the dominant trope around which you harness your memories. So in other words, I'm saying that there's sort of a consensus between East and West in holding up World War II as the major vehicle for collective remembrance in ways that have, again, not helped. If we talk about that great swathe of Central Europe through the 20th century, it's not been so much the contours of wars, finishing and ending, it's just been the contours of successive periods of occupation and violence,
Yes.
Whether it be Nazi, whether it be Soviet, and some others too.
Yeah.
So in some ways there's a complicity amongst all of us across East-West divides, and in particular now stretching geographically towards the United States, in holding up World War II as one of the main kind of touchstones of memory around which we organise the way we think about great events and our current role in relation to those kind of memories which are collectively shared. Would that be a fair comment?
I think we are guilty of, in some cases, not exploring the elasticity of our reference points. For East Europeans, the Second World War doesn't begin in 1939, it doesn't begin in 1941, it doesn't end in 1945. For many of them, it's a 30 years crisis, and the interwar periods, which may have been in Western Europe the scene of political confrontations, in many of these areas, particularly in Central East Europe, it was all-out conflict and warfare, particularly by states and regimes against civilians. So the reference points you're absolutely right, need to be elastic. Why I guess prioritise the war in our discussion is because I think in the dominant memory in these places, perhaps because of the way in which the 20th century has been segmented in these different periods, the war resonates most. The Second World War resonates most in the popular imagination. And what I said before about those resistance movements propagating types of societies and nations that seem unattractive to us at the moment, that perhaps may be unattractive to us looking from the outside. But in a time of significant economic crisis, in a time of significant refugee influx of people who do not look like the people who live there, they're becoming more and more attractive. And somehow the images of society and what they're represented by these resistance movements of ethnic homogeneity, of nation and of health have been crystallized, I think, in that post-war memory, have become central to what these new nations in the Baltics, in Central Eastern Europe, have found to identify themselves as new nations. So, yes, 39-45 is our reference point, but it seems to me that this process of resistance, of nation building, of hero worship that we're seeing play out at the moment is indeed a result, not of those 6 years, but a result of that incredible 30 years of unsettlement. It of course has previous antecedents, but it's that crazy 30 years in this period that we really see unravel in common memory.
So let me be provocative then and say that in some ways it's better to forget, because every active remembering has some sort of contemporary agenda which is often driven from the top, often driven by political leaders, people in positions of power, and whilst deliberately going out of its way to cultivate a more popular embrace, in other words, cultivating a collective memory, these top-down efforts have such agendas that they are so contemporary to political agendas that they can confuse, they can stir up emotions, they can create sources of conflict and contest just as much as any notion of healing, which is often associated with how we remember things. And, there would be a couple of examples I could instance if we look a little bit away from Europe for a moment. The current partial re-embrace of Chiang Kai-shek in China is one example. He is less demonised at the moment by the current communist regime because it's in their interest at the moment to position themselves in a particular stance against the Japanese, for which they want a broad-based popular support. So in other words, Chiang Kai-shek's partial rehabilitation by the Communist Chinese today is very much in response to their need to have a popular notion of anyone resisting the Japanese throughout history being a good person. And Chiang Kai-shek did that, so he's partially at least rehabilitated. If I turn to the United States, we see recurrent episodes around people from the South arguing about the real interpretation of what the Civil War was all about, how their constitutional rights were trampled, and how they should be allowed to fly the Confederate flag as a sign of their distinctiveness. And they're not really being bowed at all by the result of the war. Now again, it's pretty hard to make an argument that this is contributing to healing or a process that's anything other than driven by particular interests who want to position themselves politically within the federation of the modern United States. So I'm being slightly provocative, but I'm suggesting that such are the agendas often led by political elites around collective remembering, that they're often not really that interested in a process of healing as much as they are of stirring for particular ends at particular times.
I think you're right, and I often have this image of politicians trying to raise the dead for support of their contemporary policies. Fascinating examples in Asia and America. There are concurrent examples to bring us back to Europe just for a moment. We'll get back to the other side of the world. In Ukraine, there's such a fraught history of post-communist regimes rehabilitating anti-Soviet resistors from the past for different reasons. Now, the most pertinent rehabilitation by President Poroshenko has been the acknowledgement of the Ukrainian liberation movement in the Second World War and its immediate aftermath as legitimate defenders of the Ukrainian people. These people fought against the Soviets, and resurrecting them in this way certainly makes sense when you're fighting a war against the heirs to the Soviet Union, the contemporary Russian state. The problem, which I alluded to earlier, unfortunately, is that these resistant fighters were not merely fighting against the Soviet Union, they were fighting to create a Ukrainian homeland that was ethnically pure, free from Jews, Poles, and even indeed Russian speakers, who many consider to be traitors to the Ukrainian fold. So you raise the dead at your peril, and Poroshenko's regime, in dealing with some fanatic right-wing resistance that was at once support at Maidan, may be a pressing example of how the past can affect the present. As for forgetting, I wish we could forget, but I don't think we can. And I give Germany as an example. Not so much forgetting in the immediate aftermath of war, but a complicity of silence. A complicity of silence that very conveniently was able, in the Nuremberg trials and in a very fraught denazification process, pinpoint blame for the ills of Germany, pinpoint blame for the horrific things that Germany had done to Europe on a select number of fascists who had led the German people astray, supposedly, positioning the common German people as victims first of this rapacious, evil regime that was somehow an anathema to German history. This, of course, was wrong on so many levels, and a second generation, a post-war generation, began to unravel these lies. There's an argument to be made, of course, that contemporary Germany, perhaps, is a good example of how coming to terms with past in a certain way has led to a better society than that which came before it. So, and that's not done with forgetting, it's done with coming to terms, albeit very difficultly and not completely, but still trying to come to terms with what previous generations had done in your name, with what previous generations had done, and how their conduct in the war still has echoes in your life and in the life of others, in your dominant economic position in Europe, in the way that you live. I mean, these are all pressing issues of self-reflection, but it seems that in Germany, at least, despite the current rumblings of xenophobia, that for the past 20 or 30 years, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there has been this growing consensus that's more honest about its past. The question is that can that consensus survive what we consider to be one of the most significant challenges, not only to German self-identification, but to Europe's own self-identification as a union, as a body accepting of people who share its common civic values.
And I guess for Germany, that's a particular challenge because Germany has played a lead role in the cultivation of a European identity.
Yes.
And that was part of Germany's process of healing after World War II, and one of the reasons, indeed, I suspect, why it took such a lead role. So that very important sense of Europeanness is now under stress as different parts of Europe react with less sense of accord to the refugee numbers entering Europe. Would that be a fair comment?
Well, I think so. And is it a question of that complicity of silence going across not only Germany but in France, but in the Netherlands, where myths of resistance to Nazism and so forth were elevated to plug the gaps of mass collaboration with the German state across these lands. is it a question that the complicity of silence, the forgetting, if you will, cannot withstand the challenges that face it, whether it be the economic ones that we saw with the Eurozone crisis and the sort of the internal devouring of Europe, and now such an incredible refugee crisis which threatens to do the same, or is already doing the same. Perhaps if we're going to talk about using memory or being a part of a memory process that's important in building socially stable and healthy societies and attitudes toward the past, then forgetting, certainly in the experience of Europe, doesn't seem to be able to build something that's long-standing and resilient.
That's probably a good point on which to take a break, but we will return to such questions. Thanks, Philip.
Thanks, David.